And the first speaker this afternoon is Toby Keane, Clinical Quality Assurance Officer with the ACT Ambulance Service. Toby will explain telephone CPR, and of course there's been a number of references about all the issues that are involved there and how critical that is. He'll explain telephone CPR in the ACT and a new call taker protocol. Toby's experience extends to working as a flight paramedic. In fact, I gather he was on the Snowy Hydro Southcare helicopter team at some point. A clinical educator, operations manager. He had a 12-month attachment to the Australian Federal Police. That doesn't mean he was helping them with their inquiries. He was actually attached to them, working with them, as an operations support paramedic, and has been deployed in relief operations in Victoria and also in post-typhoon operations in the Philippines in 2013. I relate very much to that. I was visiting straight after a typhoon in the General Nakar region in the Philippines, and I know how devastating those typhoons can be, causing mass problems. So that would have been a very traumatic experience, but also a very important one. And also he was on relief operations in WA in 2015. He continues to work as an intensive care paramedic, and for his services, especially in the ACT, but I mean he's done all this other work elsewhere. In 2015, he was a recipient of the ACT Community Protection Medal. So would you please welcome Toby Keane.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? That's good. I'm not going to use this. This presentation, this story, begins with a mistake. It wasn't a big mistake. It was probably a fairly innocent mistake. It was a mistake made by a professional, someone who was experienced and trained, someone who was making the most of the limited information they had at the time, and they made a judgment. Their judgment was that someone who had rung for assistance on a 000 call, did not require CPR. That was the judgment they made. And at the end of that judgment, someone was dead. Someone quite young, someone who otherwise might have lived. Now that might sound very tragic, but this story is not about that mistake. This story is about what we did about it. This story is about how we can take mistakes and make them better, how we can learn from our experiences. But before I tell you that story, I need to give you a bit of background. So, for all of our international guests, the blue is Australia. You're in sort of the bottom of the middle, and that dark blue bit is Canberra. Canberra is in fact the capital of Australia, and that's for our Australian guests as well. Canberra is surrounded by the Australian Capital Territory, or the ACT. It's got about 400,000 people living in it, predominantly suburban, but we've got some nice rural areas that are very nice as well. Canberra was recently voted Australia's most livable city. Take that, Melbourne. Paramedic services in the ACT are provided by the ACT Ambulance Service. We've got just under 200 staff, and we attend nearly 50,000 emergency cases a year. There's a couple of things that are interesting about the ACT Ambulance Service, but the bit that's relevant to this presentation is that we run our own call centre. Now, lots of services run their own call centre, but what's particularly interesting about ours is that we don't run a commercial medical priority dispatch system. We do all our own clinical governance for that call centre. We set our own response priorities, our own secondary questions, our own dispatch matrices. This is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it means we're nimble and agile and we can change things really quickly. On the other hand, we're completely responsible for everything that goes on, good and bad. So what did we do after this mistake? Because clearly, if we're going to manage the clinical governance in the call centre, we are responsible for it. We can't palm that off to a software company somewhere else. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we had to do was ask ourselves some hard questions. And here's the three I'm going to talk about today. The first is it actually possible to reliably detect a cardiac arrest over the phone? The second question that's important to me as a risk manager is, if we can do that, at what cost do we do it? because nothing comes without cost, and we need to understand that. And then the third question that I have as a scientist is, does this actually have a patient-centred outcome? Like, does it matter at all if we don't recognise them? So, having asked those questions, we set about finding some answers. And where we started was with language. So, as paramedics, we understand that someone's in cardiac arrest if they're unconscious with no detectable signs of circulation. And we use all sorts of medical terminology for that. They're unconscious, unresponsive, they're apneic, they've got agonal respirations. And we train our call takers, as I'm sure many of you do, elaborately in medical terminology. They're excellent in medical terminology. Unfortunately, none of the 50,000 people who call us every year have been trained in medical terminology. They use all sorts of different language. They don't talk about agonal respirations. They talk about moaning and groaning. They don't talk about being unresponsive. They talk about people who are asleep and won't wake up. They don't talk about cardiac arrest. They talk about funny turns and collapses and all sorts of weird things. So that was our first thing. We needed to understand the language. Next, we actually needed to go and look at what everyone else was doing. Because if you steal from one person, that's plagiarism. But if you steal from lots of people, that's research. So we went and did some research. Okay? And here's what we came up with. A process. So this process is used, to this day, by every call entering our call centre with a request for ambulance. Okay? So it's very simple. The first thing and obvious thing is we need to confirm where the hell we're going. That's not always as simple as it sounds, but we confirm a location, create a case. Once we've done that first step, we can actually dispatch an ambulance. So an ambulance can be dispatched while we're doing the other questions. Next is the patient's age, unless it's obvious, you know, my husband has just collapsed. It's probably not an 8-year-old we're dealing with. The next two questions are important, and here's where we get to the crux of the issue. Is the patient awake and talking? Not conscious, not responsive, awake and talking. The second question is the patient breathing normally? The N word is critical. Absolutely critical, as I'll show you shortly. Okay? So you can't drop that N word. If the answer to those two questions is no, nil, or not sure, then the very next thing our call taker says is, we need to start CPR. There are no further questions. So we offer CPR at that point, once we get the answers to those two questions. Okay, so how do we do this? Okay, there's no special sauce, there's no secret ingredient. It's education, 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 with a dash of feedback and a large amount of monitoring, and then some more feedback and some more monitoring and some more education. We had a full-time person, a full-time quality assurance officer who did nothing but listen to 000 cardiac arrest calls for 12 months. I can assure you this is an incredibly difficult job. It's emotionally and physically incredibly draining just to listen to people dying all day. But what that meant was that we could give feedback to our call takers in a very, very timely fashion, sometimes within minutes of the call ending and certainly within 24 hours. It allowed us to monitor very closely our accuracy rates. It allowed us to make changes on the fly if we needed to. And then we could do another round of education through the in-service program or through a notice out to the work group. And then some more monitoring and some more feedback. And this went on for quite a while. So, how do we monitor the success of this or not? So we implemented this in 2013. In 2014, we decided to do an audit. So it was a 13-month audit, and then we did another one in 2017. The process is the same for both, so I'll explain the process for 2014. We already monitor all of our cardiac arrests that paramedics go to. So a definition, a cardiac arrest as far as we're concerned is when the paramedics arrive and the patient has no signs of circulation. Now at that point they may decide not to start resuscitation and they become deceased, or they may start a resuscitation. Okay, we'll split that out later. But for the purposes of the call centre, if they were in cardiac arrest on paramedic arrival, then we looked and listened to the call and determined, did the call taker recognise that they were in cardiac arrest at that time or not? And also, how long did it take them to recognise they were in cardiac arrest? That gives us our sensitivity. Our sensitivity is the statistical term for our accuracy. How many did we get? How many did we miss? Okay. Then what we did was we looked at every single call where we offered CPR and coached CPR, but the patient wasn't in cardiac arrest when we got there. And that gives us our false positive rate. That's the cost. I'll come back to that in a sec. So we did that in 2014, and then we looked at our results and go, right, we're just going to settle for the time being. We've made this change. We're going to release our call-taking staff to do something else for a little while, because sadly this was not the only issue facing our comm centre. But then in 2017 we go, it's been a few years, we need to do this again. So we did the exact same process at the end of 2017. And I should mention that for all of those cardiac arrest patients, because we review them all already and stick them in our registry, we track them through to survival to discharge. So I can report survival stats for you too. All right, so how did we go? In the ComSend, sensitivity. Remember I said sensitivity is about our accuracy. Okay? We thought 75% accuracy would be good, and I've recently learned that international standard is 75% accuracy for this, and so we're reasonably happy with 100%. In 13 months, we did not miss a single cardiac arrest. Not one. That's really, really good, except the statistician in me knows that if you start at 100%, there's only one way to go from there. And so when we looked again in 2017, I was not shocked to find out that we had gone down. I was actually quite stealing myself for it. So in 2017, we hit 98%. That's really good for us. But also that 2%, we learn more from our mistakes. How did we miss those 2%? Guess what? The call taker didn't ask the questions correctly. They were either diverted down the wrong path and didn't ask them at all, or they asked the wrong wording. They asked responsive rather than awake and talking, or they dropped the normally off the breathing, and so they missed it. And we were able to feed that back to them and feed that back into the work group. So this is really good, and hopefully we can sustain it. I'll come back next year and I'll give you a third set of data. We'll see if we have. What about our false positives? Okay. For us, we don't worry about false positives so much, but other systems will need to think about it. Okay. The reason why is it's all very well to say that we've captured 100% of cardiac arrests and we've offered CPR. The problem is if you're going to dispatch to a cardiac arrest based on that, you need to have an understanding of how many times you're dispatching and it won't be a cardiac arrest when you get there. Now, for us in the ACT, for cardiac arrest work, we have good response times still. We have good cooperation from fire and rescue who first respond for us and frankly aren't that busy. And we've got a nice geographically constrained area. For other services, this false positive rate is going to be an issue, particularly once you start adding community first responders and crowdsourcing first responders. Okay? So for our false positives in 2014 was 61%. By 2017, that had blown to 75%. Put it in another way, for every 4 cases we dispatched as a cardiac arrest, 3 of them were not. They were something else. Now, for us, we looked at those 3 cases and said, what were they? Okay, they were either fitting, they were having a stroke or some other kind of intracranial event, or they were a drug overdose. And within the fitting group, there was a large number of febrile convulsions. They were all things we would have dispatched to anyway. Okay, that's fine. We're happy to send ambulances to those. But sending fireys or crowdsourcing members of the public for first response for this, that's going to be a challenge for us. And as we look at apps that's crowdsourced for us, we really need to look at this false positive rate and how we're going to manage that for first responders. And other services are going to need to look at this too. Because we don't want to drop our accuracy, but it would be nice if we could get this down a bit. What about time? How long did it take us to do this? Well, in 2014, we could identify it 50% of the time in under 45 seconds. That is from the moment we answered the phone. So in that 45 seconds, they answered the phone, got a location, created the case, asked the 2 questions, and started CPR coaching. 50% of the time. It never, in 2014, took longer than 75 seconds. Okay, by 2017, it had blown out a little. We're now, the median's now at 60 seconds. And our QA people say to me, it's because we had trainees in the room. They slowed down. Okay, I'll accept that for now. But again, we never took longer than 90 seconds to make this determination and start CPR coaching. So we can do this fast, but does it matter? Okay, so let's look at actual cardiac arrest outcomes. Okay, so return to circulation. Ambos love talking about return to circulation because, that's what they had when they left our care. So in 2014, it was 34%, and it's gone up to 48%. That's great, like return to circulation. Who cares? Let's talk about the real data. Let's talk about survival to discharge. In 2014, our survival to discharge was 18%. Now, this is all comers. Shockable, non-shockable. Adults, kids, trauma, medical, hangings, drownings, everyone. Everyone we laid hands on, everyone we started CPR on is in this group. Okay? We thought 18% was quite reasonable. But in the 3 years, it's changed. It's gone up to 31%. Again, all comers. This isn't just call taker recognition. Our educators and our paramedics have done a lot of work in high-performance CPR in that 3 years period. We've done a lot of work around our dispatching of first responders, particularly the fireys. So there's a lot of system changes in there. But 31%, we're actually quite happy with that. Again, I'm nervous as to which direction it goes next, but I'm quite pleased with that for the time being. What about shockable rhythms? Let's look at shockable rhythms. So around about half were in shockable rhythms when we got there. 57% had ROSC in 2014. That's up to 74% this year. Whoopie-doo. Survival to discharge, 41%, 63% survived to discharge if they were initially in a shockable rhythm. So nearly 2 out of 3 who were initially in a shockable rhythm when our paramedics arrived left hospital alive. Unfortunately, I don't have quality of life measures or 12-month survival, but I'm still not unhappy about that. Okay. What about time? Does time matter? Now, the next few graphs I'm going to show you show how long it took the call taker to recognise and start CPR coaching. So that's along the bottom there, less than 15 up to 60 plus seconds. And what we did was, because we're going to break this down into a few smaller groups, we combined all the 2014 and 2017 data together to give it some statistical power. So you won't see that trend in there, but what you'll see is consolidated data, and the statisticians in the room will be nodding and smiling saying, well done, Toby. That's bystander CPR rate. That's based off VACUS. That's based off our electronic PCR. Did the paramedics document bystander CPR occurring when they arrived? That's surprisingly high. I was having a look at Ambulance Victoria's stats today. Theirs is much lower, which makes me a bit nervous that maybe we're over-reporting. But let's just go with that for now. That's not that interesting in terms of time. It just shows that we're good at coaching CPR. But this is where it gets interesting. Okay, this is the proportion of patients in shockable rhythms when we arrived. Now, you'd think, that maybe if you recognise really quickly and get there, you'd find patients in shockable rhythms, but you don't. Okay, it's this group in the 30 to 60 second bracket that end up in a shockable rhythm. And if it takes longer than 60 seconds, they don't end up in a shockable rhythm either. This is even more pronounced when you look at ROSC, and even more pronounced when you look at survival. Anyone want to hazard a guess as why we get this peak of survival at the 45 to 60 second mark? It's agonal resps. It's that, are they breathing normally? When we analysed the calls, what we found was that in this group, there's a disproportionate number of people that have what is described as agonal respirations. And so when we get there, they end up in a shockable rhythm, they're more likely to survive. This is why that question, are they breathing normally, becomes so important. Because if we didn't ask the are they breathing normally, we would miss this group. And these are our survivors. These are the ones where we're actually going to make a difference. So we've managed to reinforce that idea, that word normally. It's so important, you can't drop it off the end. And when we've listened to calls where they've dropped the normally off the end, it actually changes the way the caller responds to it. Because if you ask the question, are they breathing, you get a yeah, but, and then we never explore the but. But if we ask, are they breathing normally, we get a no, but. And then who cares if we never explore the but, as long as we then act on that no. So this is really important and is a really good validation. So, answer our questions. Can we reliably detect cardiac arrest over the phone? The answer is yes, we can. We've seen this over the last 3 years. You can do it with just 2 questions. And you can do it fast. Thing is, doing it super, super quick is not actually associated with improved survival. You want to take a little bit longer to pick those agonal rests because they're a little bit trickier to find than someone who is just out not breathing at all, because that's where your survivors are going to be. Now, I get to stand up here and talk to you all, and to the glory and kudos go me, of course. However, I didn't really participate very much in this at all. Cardiac arrest performance is a measure of the whole system, and I've spent the last day and a half downstairs in a meeting where we've talked about how cardiac arrest is system-level performance. And so I need to acknowledge everyone in the ACT ambulance service and the ACT health system that contributed to this. Our ComSen staff, our paramedics, educators, our logistics staff, support staff, the people who do the rostering, everyone has played a part in these results, and we need to acknowledge them. So I'd like to thank you for your time today and for your part in our little story. I would have been happy to answer questions, but our learned colleague says you just have to find me later. I'll be around, and I'd love to talk to you some more about it. Thank you.